Well, welcome back, folks, to another episode of the American Genesis, the creation of our American Scripture, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and the Bill of Rights. And we have been talking about the executive branch the last few weeks, and we're going to continue talking about that today. I do want to remind you that I will not be here next Monday. Um, like you, I'm going to be ready to get ready to celebrate Christmas. And so we're going to take that Monday off, but I will be back the following Monday on the 30th. So next week is a day off for you guys. You don't have to listen to me. So, with that being said, let's get started. It's a little music, as always.
If tomorrow all the things were lost I'd worked for all my life, and I had to start again with just my children and my wife, I'd thank my lucky stars to be living here today, 'cause the flag still stands for freedom and they can't take that away. And I'm proud to be an American, where at least I know I'm free. And I won't forget the men who died and gave that right to me. And I'd gladly stand up next to you and defend her still today. 'Cause there ain't no doubt I love this land. God bless the USA.
Well, great song as always. Well, let's kind of review what we talked about last week. We looked last week at, first of all, we looked at the qualifications of the president, which are fairly minimal 35. You have to be a natural born citizen. You have to have lived in the United States for 14 years. Of course, there's a lot more to it than just that, but that's the constitutional qualifications. We looked at the benefits, the pay, which is really, folks, pretty nominal. I can't imagine anybody going into seeking the presidency for money, at least to pay. Let's put it that way. Then we looked at the roles of the president. That's what we spent the majority of the time last week on. We first of all looked at the three constitutional roles, which are laid out in the Constitution. The president, the chief executive, where he is, assigned the task of executing all laws. With that comes the power of executive orders and also the powers of executive privilege and executive immunity, which we talked about. He's also the chief diplomat. That means that he basically negotiates all treaties. He can issue executive agreements. He appoints all foreign officers. He recognizes foreign states, accepts their ambassadors in. And most importantly, in some people's mind, he is the commander in chief. He is in charge of the military. And while he cannot declare war, he most certainly can commit war. That we've seen that happen. In fact, the last declared war in American history was the Second World War. The Korean War, the Vietnam War, the War on Terror, all these wars, the Gulf War, all these were undeclared wars. Now, there has been attempts to kind of control this power. 1973, at the aftermath of the Vietnam War, Congress passed something called the War Powers Resolution, but it's never been really put into effect. And for the most part, presidents and Congress have kind of ignored it because it's probably unconstitutional, to be very honest. The president also has certain legislative powers. In the separation of powers and checks and balances part of the Constitution. He gives the State of the Union. He prepares a budget. He could veto legislation, very important power. He also has judicial power. He appoints all federal judges. He has the power of pardon, which is pretty much unlimited. And finally, the president acts as the ceremonial head of state. We don't have, royalty in this country. So it is up to the president to kind of be the ceremonial head of state. He throws out the first baseball pitches. He starts the NASCAR races. He welcomes in the NFL champions and the NBA champions, these kind of things. He entertains heads of state from other countries. And of course, he is the campaigner in chief. Much of his time is spent campaigning for his political party. So these are the jobs and the roles of the president. So let's look at a trivia question today. Presidential succession is as follows, and the Constitution lays this out very specifically. In order, the vice president, and then the Speaker of the House, and the President pro tempore of the Senate, and then cabinet members in order of creation. So, what cabinet official would be the first to assume the president in case of emergency? Let's say that a terrible event occurred where the vice president and the president, the Speaker of the House, the President pro tempore were all assassinated or lost their life in some kind of event instantaneously. What cabinet member would be the next in line to accept the presidency? Okay, well, President George Washington created the first cabinet in 1789, and the first office he created was the Secretary of State, who is nominally the executive officer in charge of all foreign affairs. Thomas Jefferson was his first Secretary of State. If President Trump's nominees are approved and something did occur like this, then the person that would become the President of the United States under those circumstances would be Marco Rubio, who is currently a senator from Florida. Now, this probably is never going to occur because we now have the 25th Amendment, which kind of overshadows this part of the Constitution. And we'll talk more about that. The 25th Amendment. Might get to it today, we may not. Okay, what we're going to do today primarily is talk about the people that work alongside the president. He has a vast array of advisors that does his bidding. Seemed like I read somewhere where there are approximately 3,000 presidential advisors in all sorts of agencies and cabinet members that he appoints. Some of those have to be approved by the Senate, some do not. So let's kind of look at the layers of advisors. We're not going to go into this to a lot of detail, but we'll talk about it a little bit. One of the first executive orders issued was the creation of a set of advisors by President Washington. He issued an executive order almost instantaneously when he became president, creating what he called his cabinet. As the nation became larger and the job of governing became more complex, we have developed a very vast, sometimes multi-layered group of advisors that have become known as the institutional presidency. And there are four main groups that make up the institutional presidency. There is the cabinet, which is the official advisors. These are appointed by the president and must be confirmed by the Senate. There is the executive office of the president. Some of these have to be appointed by the Senate, some of them do not. There is the White House office, which is actually kind of the at-will appointees. These are kind of the advisors. It's almost like more like the political wing of the White House. These are the people that advise him in, I won't say an unofficial capacity, but they do not need the approval of the Senate. And of course, we have the office of the vice president. Sometimes that's been very important and sometimes it has not been. Sometimes presidents will appoint people that agree with him totally, as is the case, I think, that we are seeing with President Trump. He is appointing people who agree with his concepts of ideas of governing. Sometimes presidents will appoint those that disagree with him. Most famously, President Abraham Lincoln appointed what became known as his team of rivals, people that ran against him for the presidency and were outspoken opponents. Of course, he did this in part because he was facing the Civil War, and he knew that he was going to have to work with those people that disagreed with him. So, every president appoints his advisors in a different way. So let's look at the cabinet, first of all. Now, the Constitution does not specifically and explicitly establish the cabinet. it's inferred in Article 2, Section 2, Section 1, when it vests all executive power in the president singly and authorizes but does not compel the president to require the opinion in writing of the principal officer in each executive departments upon any subject relating to the duties of their respective offices. So it doesn't exactly say this is the cabinet, but it kind of taking the British model, it kind of inferred that. Washington appointed 4 people to his cabinet when he began. These were the Secretary of State, which was Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of the Treasury, which was Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of War, which no longer exists. Now we have the Secretary of Defense. That man was Henry Knox, and the Attorney General, who was in charge of the judicial part of the government, who was Edmund Randolph, who, by the way, if you remember when we talked about the Constitutional Convention, Edmund Randolph did not originally sign the Constitution, and yet he became one of the most important men at the beginning of the government. The vice president was not included in the original cabinet. That's because at that time, and actually for most of the 19th century, the vice president was thought of as being more of a legislative position. He was the president of the Senate. It was kind of thought that his job primarily, and it was to preside over the Senate. It's not been until the 20th century that vice presidents became much more involved with the cabinet and the executive branch. And now today, they very seldom attend the Senate, except in cases where the Constitution requires it, or if there's a chance of a tie, which is a tiebreaker. The heads of the cabinet, as well as all other federal agency heads, are nominated by the president and then presented to the Senate for confirmation. That's the ones that need it. Of course, not every one of them does. Normally, the opposition political party pretty well goes along with the president. Now, not always. In fact, the case has kind of become a routine situation where the political party will decide ahead of time who they're going to oppose because they don't want to give just carte blanche to the president. So they kind of, usually single out 1 or 2 people that he appoints for the cabinet or a high level position. And it's pretty well known. I have a theory, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I have a theory that Trump's first nominee for Attorney General, which was a House member from Florida, might have been put up as a sacrificial lamb. I'm not for sure that Trump ever thought he was going to be approved by the Senate. I kind of think he maybe put him up there to basically give the Senate a chance to basically say no, and they didn't even say no. It was so overwhelmingly against him, even within the Republican Party, that he withdrew his nomination pretty rapidly. I may be wrong on that, but I've got a funny feeling that's what happened. Now, the cabinet positions are a fluid group. There's no indication, there's no set standard about who is going to be in the cabinet. Now, obviously, the Secretary of Treasury and Secretary of State, the Defense Secretary, and the Attorney General, the original 4 ones in a sense, are almost always there, or have been actually. Other than that, it kind of comes and goes. For instance, the Postmaster General was one of the original groups under Washington. Postmaster General is not part of the cabinet anymore. The Secretary of the Navy is no longer in the cabinet where he was for most of the time. Now you have new agencies like Homeland Security. So it kind of comes and goes. And so some presidents will put this person in the cabinet and not others. So the cabinet's kind of the big one. Now, there's also what's called the executive office of the president. These are kind of people that advise the president. Some of them require senatorial approval under the law. Some of them do not. There's a whole bunch of agencies, but basically there are 4 that really kind of overshadow the rest of them. One of them is the National Intelligence Chief. That's a relatively new position. One of the things we got out of 911 when we saw the disaster that occurred there was that there was not a lot of interdepartmental communication between our intelligence divisions. And so they created the National Intelligence Chief, who is supposed to be in charge and kind of the person that's going to, uh, oversee all the intelligence operations of the United States government. A lot of people wonder if that's really being done. There's a lot of concerns about this because each one of these things, like the CIA and the NSA and the FBI and some of these places, they all have their little territorial ideas, and they don't want to give up their power. And so a lot of people wonder if this is really working out as well as it should have. Then there's the National Security Council, which provides advice on matters of national security, both foreign and domestic. And this can be made up of different groups of people. For instance, obviously, the National Intelligence Chief is going to be there, as is the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense, the National Security Council advisor, who, kind of an overlap with the Secretary of State and Defense. And then there's the Office of Management and Budget, which is the economic wing of the president. And he helps coordinate the president's legislative but budgetary proposals. Very important office. And also the Council of Economic Advisors. Some presidents use these a lot. Some just don't even use them at all. I don't think Trump really used the Council of Economic Advisors very much when he was president. I think he felt like he had as much knowledge about economics as they did. So he didn't really use them very often, as I recall. So the executive office of the president is kind of the inner core of the advisors. It's less formal than the cabinet, but in some ways it may have more power than the cabinet in many ways. So that's the executive office of the president. By the way, that picture is a picture of the National Security Council meeting at the time, I believe, when Osama bin Laden was being exterminated by our military. So the White House office, this is the political wing. This is the West Wing. Some of you may remember watching that TV show. I'll be honest, I don't know why. I never watched it. It just was something I never got into, and kind of surprised me because that's the kind of thing I usually would enjoy. But I never watched that show. But it was one of those, it's a situation where you have the political advisors of the White House comprised of this. Usually the head of this is what's called the Chief of Staff. By the way, President-elect Trump is making headlines on his Chief of Staff. He appointed a woman, which is the first time that a woman Chief of Staff has been appointed. So that's kind of a unique situation. It's comprised of approximately about 400 advisors, assistants, special assistants, press secretaries, public relations advisors, pollsters. It's the people that serve at will. These are the president's political people. And they're totally accountable to the president. They don't have to go to approval by the Senate. And he can get rid of them anytime he wants, and he can put in new people anytime he wants. The Chief of Staff's position, by the way, has become extremely important in recent presidential history. This kind of started with President Nixon. He was the one that really kind of elevated the Chief of Staff, and it got bigger and bigger as the years went by till today. A lot of people actually consider the Chief of Staff almost like an assistant president. The Chief of Staff is a very important person. And you can see here, President Nixon with his Chief of Staff, I think it was H.R. Haldeman, as I remember. And, he really ran the White House like a little fiefdom. And if you wanted to see Nixon, you had to get past him. And a lot of criticism about him. In fact, he was one of the people that went to prison over the Watergate scandal. So every president conducts their presidency differently. And every president kind of does this through his West Wing, through his the White House office. And so the presidents kind of organize their president's office in different ways. there's actually four types, and this is getting a little technical, but I thought it was kind of interesting. There's what's called the hierarchical structure. Most presidents, most assistants report directly through a chief of staff. In other words, he's the gatekeeper. If you want to talk to the president, if you want to get to the president, you have to go through his chief of staff. Nixon started this, and probably other than him, George W. Bush was probably the one that used the chief of staff most often. I believe his man was Andrew Card, as I recall. And he was the man that kind of, I mean, he was very powerful. Then there's what's called the circular structure. The assistants report directly to the president. They don't have to go through the chief of staff. It's much more of an equitable situation. Jimmy Carter used this. Joe Biden used this. Now, without getting off into the political arena, I have to tell you that a lot of people have some concerns about the circular structure because they say that with this type of situation, sometimes the president is overwhelmed with advice. And sometimes the president doesn't always necessarily get everything he needs to know. So some people would say that, this often leads to an ineffective presidency. I'm going to leave that up to people's political judgment to decide whether or not Carter and Biden's presidency was ineffective. But they used the circular structure. There's also what's called the ad hoc structure. These are things where almost they govern by committee. You got task forces, you got committees, you got friends and advisors, and they all deal with the president. They don't necessarily go through the chief of staff, but they kind of rely a lot on their personal advisors and their friends. Ronald Reagan was a champion of this, as was Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton and Ronald Reagan were very strong advocates of the ad hoc structure. Probably the one that has been more common than not in the last few years has been what's called the charismatic structure. That's where the president, being a master of communication, and if you have a president that's extremely confident, he is going to listen to those who are kind of persuaded to rally around his opinion. President Obama did this. President Trump, this is his way of governing. He is going to listen to those who agree with him, as did President Obama. And sometimes there's concern that opposing points of views are not often presented to the president, and if they are, not often listened to as much. So, this is just the way that some people view how the president operates their White House. This is obviously, the West Wing of the White House, and you can see here's the Oval Office, the Cabinet Room. Here's some of the private rooms. Over here is the Chief of Staff. Over here is the Vice President. The Press Secretary has a pretty large office. And here is the press briefing room. If you happen to see on TV when they do press briefings every day, that's where it's being done. So it's not too far from the Oval Office. So then there's the office of the Vice President. Now, that office sometimes is important, sometimes is not, okay? For the most part, historically, the office of the Vice President wasn't very important. Its only constitutional duty, according to the Constitution, was to preside over the Senate. And that's what they did. The real duty, some pundit said, was to take the pulse of the president every morning. You go in and check his wrist to make sure he's still alive, because that's what you're doing. You're kind of sitting around like the understudy to Patrick Mahomes. You're sitting around on the bench waiting for him to get hurt so you can go in. Well, the vice president is basically standing around waiting for the president to get hurt or get sick so he can become the president, acting at least. Now, some administrations in more recent decades have kind of elevated the position of the vice president, but they've become much more important and become a much more of a trusted advisor. Eisenhower actually started this with Nixon. Reagan and Clinton gave independent responsibilities to their vice presidents, and they basically gave them jobs. A lot of people think that George W. Bush's vice president, who was Dick Cheney, was maybe the most powerful president in the history of America, American history, because he was an extremely powerful person. There are critics of Bush which say that really Cheney was the president, that Bush didn't have the gravitas to be president. I don't agree with that at all. I don't think that's true at all. You don't graduate from Harvard and Yale without having some brains. Okay, but there are people that kind of enemies of the Bushes that basically said Cheney really ran the White House. But for the most part, folks, historically, the vice president has been absolutely an office that some people say they go there so they can not be heard from again. I hesitated putting this quote up, but John Nance Garner, who was one of Franklin Roosevelt's vice presidents, said the vice presidency isn't worth a warm bucket of spit. I have to tell you, that's not what he said. I will let you use your imagination, okay? And now go no further than that. Okay, Article 2, Section 4 establishes the process for the removal of the president from office. So the president, there is constitutional provisions for the removal of the president. This is known as the impeachment process. The Constitution says the president can be impeached for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors, which, according to the Supreme Court, can be taken to mean misconduct of power. A lot of people say, what is a high crime and a misdemeanor? We know what treason is. We know what bribery is. What's a high crime and misdemeanor? The Supreme Court's kind of identified that as misconduct of power. So abusing your powers of office. The House of Representatives has the power to impeach the president by simple majority. So all it takes is one more than half to impeach the president. And then the impeachment proceedings are sent, the charges are sent to the United States Senate, where a trial takes place. And it is presided over by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Conviction requires 2/3 of the Senate. Now, I think everybody out there knows that we've had 3 presidents impeached in their life in our history. Andrew Johnson, after Abraham Lincoln, he was impeached. He was found innocent in the Senate by 1 vote. If you're interested in this, you might go back and read John F. Kennedy's book, Profiles in Courage, because he talks about different senators that were courageous in the office. And one of them was a man, I think he was a senator from Kansas, that went against his political party to vote against him removal of Andrew Johnson. And Johnson remained in office. Clinton, of course, was impeached by the House, found innocent by the Senate, or not removed. And Trump, of course, is the only president that was impeached twice. I don't think he will be impeached again because I'll be honest with you, the House and the Senate are both controlled by the Republican Party. And on top of that, I think probably the Democrats have maybe learned their lesson on this one, that maybe that wasn't such a wise thing to do. I remember there were a lot of Democratic advisors telling the Democratic Party, you guys are making a big mistake impeaching President Trump, particularly the second time, because they said, this is just going to make him a martyr. And it may well have done that. Of course, President Nixon was not impeached, but he would have been had he not resigned from office. And I think he probably would have been removed from office because they had him dead to rights. They had the tapes. He clearly had abused his powers in the presidential office. And so, he probably would have been removed from office had it went to an impeachment trial before the Senate. Okay, now, presidential succession. What happens if the president dies or becomes incapacitated? under the Presidential Succession Act, the vice president becomes the president, according to the new act that was passed in relationship to the Constitution. And they did this because of what happened to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And then after the president was the Speaker of the House, the President pro tem and the cabinet secretaries in order of creation. We've talked about that in the first, in our trivia question. Then in the 1960s, after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, people realized that maybe we needed to do something a little bit different than what the Presidential Succession Act does. So they established and passed, and it was approved, the 25th Amendment to the Constitution, where there is a much more specific succession protocol for the office of the president. So what happens if the president becomes disabled? If you don't know, it is highly suspected that President Wilson, after World War I, had a very serious stroke. And basically, folks, his wife ran the presidency for about a year before his term was up. President Wilson was unable to perform his duties, and yet he did not die. And so the vice president could not assume the office. And his wife basically assumed the office of the president. Not, literally, but probably figuratively, at least, she did. So people were concerned, what happens if the president becomes disabled and cannot perform his duties? Well, let's say that a majority of the cabinet realizes, along with the vice president, that this is occurring. Then they can inform Congress in writing that the president is incapacitated. The president may resume his duties by informing Congress that any previous incapacitation no longer exists. However, if that takes place, then the majority of the cabinet and the vice president may challenge the president's resumption of power. And if there is a challenge, Congress has 21 days to decide who is going to be the next president. So, and again, I run the risk of getting political here, and I don't intend to. I'm using this because I think we're all aware that there is a great deal of concern right now about whether or not Joe Biden what has become disabled. I'm going to leave that up to you to make that decision. But if, let's say, for instance, back in the spring, when people say that it became obvious that he was not capable of performing the offices as president anymore, if Harris, Vice President Harris, and half of the cabinet would have informed Congress that Joe Biden was no longer capable of performing the duties of president, then what would have happened? Well, he could have, and most assuredly he would have written back and said, no, I most certainly am. And the vice president and half the cabinet again could say to the Congress, no, we still think it is. Then Congress would have had to have, they would have been the ones that would have decided whether or not President Joe Biden could have continued in office. None of this happened, okay? A lot of people say maybe it should have happened, okay? And again, I'm not going to leave that's totally a political decision that each person has to make, and the people that assume the power. Obviously, the vice president and the cabinet did not think that was the case, or if they did not want to take that route. There is also situations where the 25th Amendment can be used if a president is going to be undergoing a medical procedure. For instance, when George W. Bush underwent his colonoscopy during his administration, he informed the Congress and the vice president that he was going to be incapacitated for a certain amount of time, which was only a few hours. And, at that point, Dick Cheney became, in a sense, the acting president until the president could once again assume his powers of office. So if a president is going to undergo a surgery procedure, which maybe will put him out under general anesthesia for a certain number of hours, then, they usually will go through this. So this was all brought about by the assassination of President Kennedy, because there were concerns that what would have happened had the vice president also been assassinated, and what would have happened if the Speaker and the Senate President pro tem. By the way, folks, in case you don't know, when the State of the Union takes place, and you have all these people gathered together inside the Capitol, all the Congress, all the most of the Supreme Court, all the cabinet officials, and all. There's always one person, usually the cabinet official at the lowest level. He is generally called the designated survivor. He is kept in a secure position. So if somebody, God forbid, blew up the Capitol building during the State of the Union and exterminated our whole political structure, there would be at least one person left to run the government. I don't know if you know that, but they actually do have what's called the designated survivor, and he is put into a secure position to make sure there are at least one person left to make sure. When you hate to be that person, okay? So again, assassination, incapacitation, these are all dealt with under the 25th Amendment. So, presidential effectiveness, and then we're going to stop today. Presidential effectiveness is generally evaluated by the ability of the president to persuade his voters to compromise with Congress, to gain support of political leaders, to rally the media. Some presidents are really good at this, some presidents not so much. They use a myriad of different techniques: party loyalty, professional lobbyists, personal appeals, public opinion, the media. The man that started this, because up until this time, up until Franklin Roosevelt, most presidents really, I would say, they ignored the public, but because of the technology, they didn't really have very much of a way to work with the public, because they could only meet so many people. Well, President Roosevelt understood the power of the media, and he started what became known as his fireside chats. I'm going to bet there's people out there that remember listening to some of President Roosevelt's fireside chats. I'd be interested if anybody out there remembers him giving one and listening to it, because this was kind of the start of the use of presidential using different media and lobbyists and public opinion. Like I said, some people use party loyalty. They appeal to the members of their own political party and return to President Grant's favors. Sometimes this will work and sometimes it won't. I seriously doubt right now that President Biden, being what's called a lame duck president, probably doesn't have a lot of party loyalty going on. In fact, the case, I would suspect that he doesn't have any loyalty going on. There's a lot of people within the Democratic Party that are very upset with him. They're upset with themselves. They don't know who to be upset with. They just know that things did not go the way they thought they were going to go. Okay. But some presidents are very good at this. Lyndon Johnson was terrific. Lyndon Johnson actually used the power of intimidation. It is said that he would call people of his party in and then tower over them. He was a very huge man, as is President Trump. And you see President Trump kind of doing the same thing. Maybe you've seen pictures of him with foreign leaders and grabbing their hand and basically holding their hand up and towering over them. This was kind of what Lyndon Johnson did. He started this. Some presidents have used professional lobbyists because they didn't really enjoy the hand pumping, the politics of the office. Eisenhower kind of started this when he created the Office of Congressional Relations. Other presidents, Johnson and Biden to some degree, have been a little bit more effective at this than some. Usually Congress doesn't much like using professional lobbyists. They feel like they're a little bit, they're more of an equal partner. They feel like maybe these people are sitting down there as hired guns, and they don't particularly care for this for the most part. Of course, there's the use of personal appeals. Presidents are notorious for this. White House luncheons and dinners. Who would not want to be invited to a lunch or a dinner with the president? Hey, why don't you come up to Camp David for the weekend? Let's talk about this. Or I'm going out to California. Would you like to ride out with me on Air Force One? Maybe he'll go to a prayer breakfast. Photo opportunities with the president. Every politician in America wants to be photographed with the president. Personal charm. President Reagan and Obama were masters of the personal appeal. Probably, I have to say, probably President Reagan was probably the one that had more ability to use these personal appeals than anybody else. He was able to somehow get the people that disagreed with him to work with him. Uh, Famous example here: President Reagan and Tip O'Neill, who was the Speaker of the House. They were absolute political enemies, but they liked each other. They enjoyed each other's company, and they would get together often and have a beer summit, as it's called sometimes. And they would get together, and you can see they enjoyed each other, even though they were political enemies. You don't see a lot of this going on anymore. I don't think you're going to see too many beer summits with Trump and Schumer. I don't think that's probably going to happen a lot. Some presidents use public opinion. Uh, Again, Kennedy, Reagan, Clinton, Obama were all really good at using public opinion. Trump has actually been good at using public opinion in the opposite way. Uh, the media, obviously, has the mainstream media has a really uh, issue with President Trump. He actually uses this almost as a martyrdom, you know, and he almost relishes in the fact that the media will oppose him because he thinks that this actually helps him. President Clinton was a master of using public opinion and did this very well. And then, of course, along with this is manipulation of the media. Some people can really manipulate the media to their advantage through press conferences, staged events, interviews. Sometimes it works really, really well. Uh, After all, look at this. I mean, how could you disagree that this is not uh, an advantageous situation where you are presented as the power couple on a national magazine? Obviously, grace and power. Sometimes it works the opposite. I think we all remember Mission Accomplished. President George W. Bush had some of his advisors had the brilliant idea that after one of these ships came back from the Afghanistani war, that they should have mission accomplished banner, and President Bush flew in on the aircraft carrier with obviously another pilot to some degree. He was a pilot. And he got out with his pressurized suit on and then went and changed. And they thought it was going to be a great moment, a political manipulation of the media. As it turned out, it backfired because the media used this to say the mission isn't accomplished. We got a long war ahead of us, which we did. In his defense, President Bush basically said, yes, but this ship's mission was accomplished. And he said, this is what we were trying to say and trying to salute the military people that were in charge of the ship. But it didn't work out. So that's it for today. So next week, we are going to be, hang on here a second. Next week, we're going to be off. We're not going to be working on this. So I hope you'll take the week off and enjoy your family, enjoy Christmas. And I will be back on the 30th, on a Monday the 30th, and we'll continue on from there. We'll finish up with the presidency, and then we're going to look briefly at the Supreme Court. And then we're going to get into what I think you'll really enjoy. I hope you do at least, is we're going to look at the Bill of Rights and how the Constitution has been interpreted as protecting our rights and liberties. Because I think this is where it really comes down to what we kind of see as part of the government. So I hope you've enjoyed this. I will see you in 2 weeks, and Merry Christmas to all of you. And I hope you have a very, very good time with your families. So we'll see you then.